It's July 4, 1969, at exactly 12:40 a.m., and the darkness is shattered by a hail of gunfire on the outskirts of Vallejo, California. A lone figure emerges from the shadows, firing his revolver at a young couple parked in a car. The sound of bullets piercing the night air is still echoing in the minds of those who witnessed the horror unfold. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were just 17 years old, their lives cut short in a senseless act of violence. The killer's bullets ripped through the night, leaving behind a trail of blood and shattered dreams. The scene was one of utter chaos, the sound of gunfire still reverberating through the air as panic set in. The couple's car, a blue Chevrolet, was riddled with bullets, its windows shattered, and its occupants motionless. Blood splattered everywhere, a grim reminder of the unspeakable horror that had just occurred. The night air was heavy with the smell of smoke and gunpowder, and the sound of sirens in the distance was the only thing that broke the silence. The darkness seemed to swallow everything whole, leaving behind only the faint glow of flashlights and the haunting sense of despair. The killer, still lurking in the shadows, had left behind a calling card, a cryptic message scrawled on a palm frond found at the scene. He would later become infamous as the Zodiac Killer, a name that would send chills down the spines of law enforcement officials and the public alike. But in this moment, he was just a shadowy figure, a faceless monster who had left behind a trail of death and destruction. His motives were unclear, but his actions were unmistakable, a senseless, brutal killing that would leave the world reeling. The only sound was the soft hum of the crickets and the distant wail of sirens, a haunting soundtrack to the horror that had just unfolded. Witnesses reported hearing a loud argument between the couple just moments before the shooting, but nothing could prepare them for the terror that was about to unfold. One witness described hearing a burst of gunfire that sounded like a machine gun, while another reported seeing a figure in a yellow raincoat fleeing the scene. The sounds of panic and despair were music to the killer's ears, as he slipped into the darkness, disappearing into the night like a ghost. The only thing that remained was the eerie silence that followed, a sense of foreboding that would haunt the streets of Vallejo for years to come. As the night wore on, the sounds of sirens grew louder, and the first responders arrived, ready to face the carnage that awaited them. Police officers arrived at the scene, their flashlights casting eerie shadows on the ground. What they found was a scene of unimaginable horror, 2 young lives cut short in a brutal act of violence. The officers quickly secured the area, beginning the painstaking process of collecting evidence and piecing together the events of the night. The victim's car was riddled with bullets, and the surrounding area was littered with shell casings and other evidence. The officers knew they had a long and difficult road ahead of them, as they struggled to make sense of the senseless act of violence that had claimed 2 young lives. Before we go further, hit subscribe and the bell. We post new cases every single day. Whether you're a true crime aficionado or just looking for a thrilling tale, we've got you covered. Our goal is to bring you the most in-depth, thought-provoking analysis of the world's most shocking crimes. From infamous serial killers to bizarre cold cases, we leave no stone unturned in our pursuit of the truth. Let me take you back to the very beginning of this story, to the 1960s, when the world was a very different place. The Vietnam War was raging, and the civil rights movement was in full swing. This was the era of flower power and hippie culture, of free love and social revolution. It was also the era of the Zodiac Killer, a serial killer who would claim the lives of at least 5 people in Northern California. But before we delve into the details of the killings, let's start with the man behind the mask, or rather, the lack thereof. The Zodiac Killer was a master of deception, a chameleon who seemed to blend in seamlessly with his surroundings. He was a loner, a man who lived on the fringes of society, with little to no connection to his community. He was also a man of contradictions, intelligent and educated, yet brutal and ruthless in his tactics. The Zodiac Killer was a puzzle, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. And it was this very enigma that would captivate the public imagination, making him one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. As we delve deeper into the world of the Zodiac Killer, we'll explore the motives behind his crimes, the tactics he used to evade capture, and the investigation that ultimately failed to bring him to justice. We'll examine the cryptic letters and codes he left behind, and the impact his crimes had on the lives of his victims and their families. This is the story of the Zodiac Killer, a tale of obsession and madness that will leave you on the edge of your seat. So, buckle up, folks, as we embark on this twisted journey into the heart of darkness. The Zodiac Killer case is one of America's most infamous unsolved serial killer cases, with a central figure shrouded in mystery. The killer, who has never been caught or identified, is often referred to as Arthur Lee Allen, although this has been disputed over the years. Allen's age at the time of the killings was estimated to be around 29, a relatively young age to be perpetrating such heinous crimes. He lived in Vallejo, California, where many of the killings took place. He had a seemingly ordinary life, one that would later unravel beneath the surface. Arthur Lee Allen worked as a handyman at a local elementary school, a job that allowed him to interact with children on a daily basis. Although it's unclear how his job may have influenced his behavior, it's worth noting that his interaction with minors has raised suspicions among investigators. Allen was married with one child, a son born in 1950, and seemed to have a relatively stable family life. His neighbors described him as friendly, a man who would often wave and chat with them about their day. At the same time, Allen's wife described him as having a volatile temper. Despite his seemingly ordinary life, Allen's likable and relatable qualities made it difficult for those around him to suspect him of such atrocities. He was often seen as a bit of an outsider, but his friendly demeanor put people at ease. His family and friends described him as a quiet, laid-back man who rarely spoke about his life. In fact, many who knew Allen believed him to be a bit of an introvert, someone who kept to himself. This quiet nature made it even more surprising when he began sending cryptic letters to the police and newspapers. Allen's relationships were often strained, and he had a tendency to push people away. The one person he did seem to trust was his wife, Betty, and even their relationship was tumultuous. Allen's relationships with his friends and acquaintances were often superficial, and those who got close to him reported feeling uneasy around him. There were whispers of infidelity, and some reported seeing him with multiple women at the same time. As for his relationships with his family, including his son, the dynamics seemed complicated, to say the least. On a crisp autumn evening in October 1968, the city of Vallejo in Northern California was bathed in the warm glow of streetlights, casting long shadows across the streets as a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees. It was around 8 p.m. on October 11th, with a clear sky and a temperature of around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, a perfect evening for people out and about. Vallejo, a small city with a population of around 80,000 people, was a quiet, suburban community where neighbors knew each other and the local police department was a familiar presence. The weather was pleasant, with a light wind blowing in from the Pacific Ocean, bringing with it the salty scent of the sea. As the sun began to set, the residents of Vallejo were heading home from work or school, unaware of the horrific events that were about to unfold. The events leading up to the crime were a series of seemingly unrelated incidents that would eventually all point to one man. In the days and weeks prior to the murder, the Zodiac Killer had sent a series of cryptic letters and codes to local newspapers, taunting the police and the public with his supposed identity. The letters were filled with threats and boasts of the killer's exploits, but the police were unsure if they were dealing with a prankster or a real killer. The killer had also sent a number of codes and puzzles to the newspapers, which the police were struggling to decipher. As the police tried to piece together the clues, they were still unaware of the horrific crime that was about to be committed. At around 9 p.m. on October 11th, David Faraday, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16, parked their car in a remote area overlooking Lake Herman Road in Benicia, a small town just north of Vallejo. The couple had been on a date, and David had planned to take Betty Lou to a party, but instead they had driven to this secluded spot to park and talk. As they sat in the car, the killer approached them, and in the next few minutes, he shot David in the head and neck, and Betty Lou was hit by multiple bullets, including a fatal shot to the head and another to the chest. The killer then shot out the car's tires and fled the scene, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a terrified survivor. The killer's brutality was shocking, but it was the graphic nature of the attack that would haunt investigators for years to come. Betty Lou Jensen, the 16-year-old victim, was found with multiple bullet wounds, including a fatal shot to the head, and her body was left in a twisted and unnatural position, with her hands still clutching a piece of torn fabric from her dress. The horror of the scene would stay with the police and the public for years to come. The fact that the killer had taken the time to pose Betty Lou's body in such a way would suggest a level of sadistic pleasure, and this would become a hallmark of the Zodiac Killer's crimes. The sight of Betty Lou's body would be forever etched in the minds of those who saw it. Law enforcement was initially unaware of the extent of the Zodiac Killer's reign of terror, but it all changed on July 31, 1969, when they received a cryptic letter from the killer claiming responsibility for the murder of Paul Stein, a taxi driver. The police didn't know whether to believe the letter or not, but they took it seriously and began investigating. The letter included a small piece of Stein's shirt, which was later matched to a specific gun, a .22 caliber revolver. The letter and the physical evidence sent a clear message that the killer was meticulous and intelligent. They were on the hunt for something. In 1974, a key piece of evidence changed the course of the investigation when a piece of cellophane tape was discovered on a tree at Lake Berryessa, one of the Zodiac Killer's known crime scenes. The tape was sent to the FBI's crime lab for analysis, and it was discovered to contain a small amount of human blood. The blood was matched to one of the Zodiac Killer's known victims, a young woman named Cecilia Shepard. The discovery of this blood was a major breakthrough for investigators, who were finally able to connect the dots between the different crimes. It was clear that the Zodiac Killer was leaving behind clues, but it was up to the police to decipher them. Throughout the investigation, there were several main suspects, but none of them panned out. One of the most promising leads was a man named Arthur Lee Allen, who was a convicted child molester with a history of violent behavior. Allen had been questioned by police in the early days of the investigation, but he had never been formally charged. Another suspect, Richard Gaikowski, was a journalist who had a fascination with the Zodiac Killer and had even written about him for the local newspaper. Despite their initial suspicions, Gaikowski and Allen were later cleared as suspects. The investigation continued to drag on, with no end in sight. One of the biggest mistakes investigators made was ignoring the lead on a man named Ted Kaczynski, who would later become known as the Unabomber. In 1971, a former neighbor had reported Kaczynski to the police, describing him as a paranoid and violent individual who often carried a gun. The tip was never followed up on, and Kaczynski went on to commit a string of bombings that killed 3 people and injured 23 others. It was a costly mistake for the investigators, who had been so focused on the Zodiac Killer that they missed an opportunity to catch a similar serial killer. The investigation was in a state of disarray, with no clear direction or leads. As the months went by, public interest began to wane, and the case grew colder. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final chapter of our true crime series on the Zodiac Killer. As we close the case book on this infamous serial killer, we've uncovered a twist that nobody predicted, a revelation that changes everything we thought we knew. The Zodiac Killer was believed to have only killed 5 people, but new evidence suggests that he may have claimed the life of a 6th victim, a young boy named Robert Domingos. This new information comes from a 1970s-era cryptogram, which has been decoded and verified by experts.